It's an absolutely beautiful December day here in the Pacific Northwest. Let's jump into this forest. Let's see what we see. And just up here off the side of the trail, we've got one of my absolute favorite mushrooms to work with. This is, of course, the turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. And you can see, look, it's pretty cold out here. It's been getting just down to freezing at night. And it almost looks like a little moisture on that cap may have froze. Of course, underneath we see this finely poured white surface, which is really distinctive. If this were a little bit, less damp or cold outside, we'd be able to detect a little bit of a felty or tomentose feel on the cap where we've got these banded colors. But this is, of course, growing from bigleaf maple. We can see it's moss covered, just a limb that's dropped off of a larger tree. And we see quite the flush up here. You'll notice the coloration of these can really vary or change. But one thing that's consistent is that we get these bands of colors that kind of alternate with a white margin. We also see these beautiful licorice ferns. Those have a somewhat medicinal or edible rhizome, but the actual turkey tail, this is one of the most well-documented medicinal mushrooms that you'll encounter. In fact, it's actually the most well-studied or documented. And of course, as I'm sure several of you are aware of, this is particularly noted for its assistance as a cancer aid, both in terms of a preventative and in the process of curing it, even oftentimes in conjunction with chemotherapy. So I'm sure several of you have heard Paul Stamets' TED Talk, where he brings his mom up on stage, who used this as part of her treatment to combat and kind of overcome her struggles with cancer. But incredibly powerful medicine. And it's worth noting that in Japan, this has been an approved treatment for cancer since 1977. And, even beyond that in traditional Chinese medicine, it has a long history of use. The bulk of the clinical trials focus primarily on what's known as polysaccharide K, or PSK for short. This has a whole incredible range of immunological effects and is noted as being antiviral and also regulating cholesterol and really kind of enhancing the function of our immune system. So super interesting stuff. For those of you who haven't looked into this, I'd encourage you to pick up some different resources and to really dive deeply on this topic. To me, it's just fascinating, and it's something that certainly worked its way into my typical routine. So very cool to see this one out here. Again, turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. And boy, this fog's making the forest especially magical today. And check this out, growing from a red alder snag that recently fell over, we've got an incredible and strange mushroom. This is what's commonly referred to as the snow white crust, Plicatura nivea. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the snowy plic. Now notice that it's got this almost kind of trembling phlebia type look to it. But notice on this blue band, if I push on the side of this too, it's incredibly soft and light and kind of spongy. So it's got this very unique consistency. And when you hold this in your hand, it feels like it's almost weightless. You can see a little look underneath. This particular cluster or clump is so stunningly beautiful that I hesitate to pluck this particular one. Let me pull a different little patch over here so we can take a look at the underside of this guy. So take a look at this. I'm going to set it down so that we can really kind of zoom in and take a close look. It's just the most unique undersurface that you'll see. Look at that. Kind of wrinkled, almost looks like a crevasse network if you were to shrink yourself down to a miniature human crossing the white glacier. It is this Plicatura. It's got that really unique structure. Boy, I wish you could feel this. It is just such a fascinating little mushroom. Now, to my knowledge, this isn't edible or it doesn't have known medicinal capabilities. And to be honest, you're unlikely to read much from the local field guides. And that includes a lot of the most recently published field guides. Now, that said, I believe that Steve Trudell has a little bit of a write-up on it in Mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest in the newly revised edition. I was also really surprised to read about this in Buck McAdoo's Profiles of Northwest Fungi. So they had kind of highlighted this. That book is more or less a collection of these Mushrooms of the Month kind of features that were put out by the Mushroom Club up in Bellingham, Washington. And I would say that they were ahead of their time in really highlighting this super unique and interesting mushroom before most people had really heard of it. And it occurs in really far kind of northern latitudes. And so you'll find this, I think it was first documented in Lapland, but you'll find it throughout Scandinavia and here in Washington and British Columbia. But as you drift further south, you're unlikely to encounter this one. Now, it grows almost exclusively on Red Alder, and as I showed earlier, that underside surface is really, really unique. So that's oftentimes a defining characteristic for this. And, it didn't seem to be as common in the not so distant past, but it seems to be showing up more and more out here. And so again, almost exclusively you're going to find this on Red Alder. And you can see that it's got different growth forms. So in age, it'll get that blue banding pattern. But you can see it growing from the edge of this particular Red Alder log here. And boy, I wish you could feel this. It's also worth noting that I think it was about a couple years ago that Yi-Min Wang had an excellent post on iNaturalist because there was a little bit of confusion between Plicatura nivea. Oh, look at this. So we've got the late winter, or I should say late fall or winter oyster, Sarcomyxis erytina, growing from this same Red Alder. But anyhow, Yi-Min Wang had an excellent post on iNaturalist where he put the DNA sequence up for this one and made a clear distinction between Plicaturopsis crispa and Plicatura nivea. So Plicaturopsis crispa is similar in a lot of ways, but it's oftentimes noted as being darker and kind of like a more orangish brown cap oftentimes, and often also a single point of attachment. So it can be difficult to distinguish those, but I'd encourage you to pay attention to this one, which seems to be showing up more and more in our area in recent years. And look at this, growing from what looks to be the same Red Alder, although it's the standing snag portion that didn't fall to the ground. We've got yet another just massive flush of turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. This particular flush, boy, it's looking vibrant and plentiful. It's worth noting, you'll notice that compared to the flush that we just saw a second ago, that was on the Bigleaf maple, this particular one is significantly darker in color. And it's just got this really kind of vibrant look to it. Sometimes I find myself being attracted to different flushes of turkey tail more than others. And sometimes it's tough to put it to words. But this particular flush is a good example of one of the types that I'm particularly compelled to harvest. It oftentimes just has this kind of darker, more vibrant color, oftentimes feels a little thicker. Maybe that's the simple fact that it's fresher, but I believe that it's oftentimes attributed to the different substrates or types of trees that these flushes are coming or fruiting from. So we're more likely to find this fruiting from, of course, hardwoods. It's worth noting that occasionally I do see it flush from coniferous wood, but more often than not from hardwoods. This one in particular fruiting from Red Alder. And again, this just really awesome medicinal this time of year. Immunomodulating, anti-inflammatory. I think I'll go ahead and harvest some of this. And check this out. Here's a mushroom that I always enjoy bumping into out here. Relatively common. This one is the Ambiguous Stropharia, Stropharia ambigua. And similar to the turkey tail, we can see the moisture on the cap is frozen over. Back here we see more Ambiguous Stropharia examples in different stages of growth. We can see some really young ones just popping up and others that are more mature. But notice that it's got this shaggy kind of margin. This is what's commonly referred to as an appendiculate margin, so the remains of the partial veil dangling off the side of the cap there. And underneath we see white gills. In time, these are going to turn kind of a dark purple black color, so we know that this is relatively young and doing its thing. This is actually noted as being edible, but it's not one that's often sought out to bring home to the table. It's reported as tasting kind of terrible. So one that I always love to admire out here, but not one that I ever seek out to forage, but certainly beautiful to look at. And take a look at this. We've got a relatively old growth Douglas fir that came down along with a younger one, so this is surely a victim of the recent windstorm. Boy, as I look back there, I can see a couple more down dug firs. You wouldn't guess that there's a trail running straight through there. It's quite covered with debris and limbs and whatnot, but let's take a look at this. Boy, I always love getting an opportunity to look at what's going on in the canopy of these big, older growth trees. We can see on this limb we've got quite the display of lichen growth. Boy, it's just fascinating to think about the ecology of what all's going on up in the heights. Quite a display of lichen diversity up there. And boy, if we really take a look, it may be tough to convey or to capture the scale of this, but this is a really good size, older growth Doug fir. Certainly, well, I don't know, I would guess somewhere between 100 and 200 years old. This representing just the top or the kind of crown of this. So you can see those deep furrows in that Doug fir. And very high up there, I would estimate somewhere, I don't know, whether that's 60, 70 feet up, we see where that top portion has snapped off. You can see right there is where the wind broke that off. So interestingly enough, so this is going to be a significant standing snag. These are a really important feature aspect of the old growth forest out here. So there are lots of animals and fungi and different part of the forest ecology or life that'll really make use of that snag. We can see, I'm standing up on this, so it may be tough to convey the size of this, but this is a really, really good sized tree. I always think about these kind of mother trees that have served different functions in the forests out here, shuttling nutrients to other trees through the mycelial web underneath the forest floor. It's interesting to think about the ways that this older growth Douglas fir communicated or worked with all these surrounding younger trees, mainly Douglas fir, but also other tree species that I'm seeing here. Really just amazing to think about all that this tree has witnessed before coming down to earth here. We can see a younger Douglas fir that was also taken down. But if we look inside of this, let's examine what's going on here. Boy, take a look at this. A little fungal action going on here. This is a little bit frozen because the temperature is so cold. But boy, this has a somewhat leathery consistency. Really fascinating. Isn't that interesting? Let me know what you make of that if you're watching or observing this. If I look kind of throughout this inner portion that's been kind of cracked open, look, we're seeing just tons of this little leathery white layers woven into this tree, surely weakening the integrity of it and making it somewhat susceptible to that recent windstorm. And I'm super excited to be coming across a group of a really interesting mushroom This is what's commonly referred to as man on horseback or the yellow knight. This is Tricholoma equestre. And boy, we've got a little bit of sunlight cutting through the fog here, casting a little bit of an interesting hue on this. You know, this is noted for having a yellow cap, yellow gills, yellow stipe. I'm aware that the camera right now is not really detecting the true yellow color. It's making it look a little more white than yellow. Let's see if we can rectify that up here. So notice this is pushing up through the forest stuff. I'm going to brush off that cap a little bit. See if we can get this on film, really capturing that yellow color. For whatever reason, the camera doesn't always love that shade of yellow. But you can see nice firm stature. It's going to have a white spore print, notched gills, and boy, that's looking more white on film than it is to my eye. Let's see if I can get that to capture the actual color. This one is, you know, in the Tricholoma genus, there we go. There's that yellow color that we were looking for. So you can really see that now on all three, on the stipe, the gills, and the cap. Notice that this cap is going to be somewhat viscid and slimy. So you can see how this dirt and debris, the needles and everything are kind of stuck to this. So a lot of times as this cap dries out or gets less viscid or sticky, that forest stuff or litter will still be stuck to the actual cap. So that's very frequent with this one. And I should add that here in the Pacific Northwest, we've got at least 5 different species that all fly under that general name, Tricholoma equestre. So we call that or refer to it as the Tricholoma equestre group. Now, oddly enough, this has been revered as a choice edible throughout Europe since at least medieval times, but recently its reputation has been severely tarnished because there were several deaths associated with this mushroom. And now granted, in all cases, it's reported that folks had really overindulged in France, Poland, I'm trying to remember where else, maybe Lithuania. But anyways, these were eaten in abundance and resulted in some unusual outcomes. So while some of your field guides will report this as being a choice edible, notably older field guides, a lot of the newer ones will cite this as being potentially deadly toxic. So, you know, there's not a lot of consensus on this. I will add that there haven't been any deaths or fatalities here in the US, and again, our species is likely different than the ones in Europe. But even that said, you know, anytime that there's reports like that, that's enough to give you pause. If you've got a strong opinion on this one, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And yeah. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to give this a little bit of a cut so that you can see what it's looking like on the inside. Now notice this has a really satisfying, firm texture. It's a pretty substantial fruit body. If we take a closer look here, it looks like there's a little bit of insect activity going on in here. Some springtail looking insects, it looks like, have taken up this mushroom and called it or made it a home. But you'll notice that this is a pretty substantial and sturdy fruit body. There's another similar looking tricholoma that's also another yellow tricholoma, Tricholoma sulphureum, that has a really toxic, terrible smell or odor to it. And that one, generally speaking, will have a much thinner stipe. It won't be quite as substantial or hardy. This one, again, very firm, very robust in its stature. Now, some of you may also remember in the late spring, early summer, we featured a lot of different mycoheterotrophic plants. Those are achlorophorous plants that lack chlorophyll and pair with different mycelium. One of those mycoheterotrophic plants that we featured was right in this same area, and it was one that we call the pine sap in the Monotropa genus. That particular plant pairs and works exclusively, to my knowledge, with the mycelium of this Tricholoma equestre group. So just an interesting little side note that I figured I would bring up since we're looking at it. And here's another great example down here. We see yet another fruit body. You kind of really have to look for them, even though they've got a distinct and somewhat vibrant color to them. The way that they push up through the duff, they can remain somewhat hidden on the forest floor. And take a look just off to the side from where we see these yellow knights. I see a darker Tricholoma poking up out of the duff, growing from the mossy floor here. Take a look at this. So again, this is likely in the same genus, Tricholoma, but a different species. And boy, I can really smell a strong farinaceous odor, which is not specific enough to get this down to species, at least not for me. But another Tricholoma mushroom hiding out. And as I move through the forest and down the trail here, check this out. So right on the trail, we've got an example of our old friend, the Pacific Golden Chanterelle, Cantharellus formosus. This guy, just a tiny little example. But you can see now that we're a week into December, you know, these guys are having to endure the rain and the cold, so they're not looking quite as appealing as they were even, you know, just a week or two ago. But they're still out here, and, you know, seeing this one right on the trail gives me pause and what makes me want to consider looking a little more closely to see if I can see any fresh flushes of one of our favorites. So it's getting late in the season, but they're still out there. Let's take a look. Here's another. This guy looking a little past its prime. I think I'm going to let him be right where he is. Keep looking. And just down here, another flash of that yellow-orange catching my eye. I can see surely another Pacific Golden Chanterelle. Let's see if it's still good enough to bring home with us, or if it's one that we're likely to leave out here. Boy, you can see just the look of it not looking quite as vibrant as they were in the not too distant past. Still not bad. For December, it's so-so, but I don't know that it's prime enough for me to want to clean it off and add it to my collection for today. Let's see what else we see out here. And sure enough, boy, no shortage of them out here, but boy, I can tell that guy's got thumped a little too hard by the rain and the cold. This one looks potentially like it may be reasonable, but boy, the firmness is kind of there. If I were a little more desperate, or if I hadn't been harvesting or foraging as many as I have this year, I might feel the urge to trim this guy up and make it work. But I think this one's going to be left behind here in the forest with its friends. Not feeling it, but it is cool to still be able to find a few out here. I'm going to keep my eyes peeled, and if any look especially fresh, I'll add them to my bag. And down here among those chanterelles, I'm seeing more of those kind of dark gray tricholomas with the farinaceous odor. These guys look especially fresh, and we can see that they're really thriving out here, so they don't seem to be minding the cold one bit. Give this guy a little tug and we'll take a closer look. Boy, you can see that kind of streaked textured cap. Really a pretty looking mushroom. Again, these tricholomas, of course, related to the matsutake or pine mushroom, hailing from the same genus, but this one definitely not in the same category in terms of desirability. And again, there are several that have a pretty similar profile, so I'm not necessarily sure exactly, what specific Tricholoma species this is. So for now, we'll be content just labeling this a gray streaked Tricholoma, but sure is pretty. And as I look around out here, I'm always interested to see the different ways that the forest has kind of changed since I've been out here last. And sure enough, as I look off there, just off trail, I see a pretty good size Western Hemlock. And one thought that really comes to mind for me is, that's going to be an excellent spot for me to check in future years for the West Coast Reishi, Ganoderma organense. That's the exact tree species that they seem to prefer. So I'm just going to make a mental note of that and check back. It's always helpful to be able to identify trees from a distance just by the bark patterns. You know, it's one of those things that goes hand in hand with a lot of mycology because, as you well know, a lot of these different mushrooms have unique associations with different trees. So if you haven't spent any time getting to know the trees in your local forest, I'd encourage you to do so. It really enhances the experience out here as you're searching for mushrooms. And growing off of this old decaying conifer log, just off trail, we've got one that we talked about last week. So this one, Chrysomphalina aurantiaca. You might recall from last week that we talked about really looking closely to see those fine little white hairs that are kind of stiff little white hairs that you can see protruding off of the cap margins. If you really look closely, that's a dead giveaway for this species. Really good looking mushroom that's quite common out here. And wow, check this out. So just down the trail, this is really, really interesting to me. So notice we've got this really well decayed log, and look what we've got growing out of it. Do you recognize this guy? This is our deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus atropurpureus. And you can see most of the boletes, including those in the Xerocomellus genus, we generally think of as being ectomycorrhizal, so forming associations with trees and really working with the roots. But just as the lichen is growing off of this dead, decaying conifer wood, so too is this Xerocomellus atropurpureus. So, you know, I've read in different places that these have a tendency to be, saprophytic when the opportunity arises. So really interesting and something to keep an eye out for. Let me know if you've had that same experience of finding this one growing from well-decayed, rotting wood. Not what we expect from a Xerocomellus, but certainly something that I've encountered more than once out here in the forest. And just up here, we've got a beautiful example of a powder cap. This is in the Cystoderma genus. Look at this, quite a photogenic mushroom. You can see that this stipe is kind of sheathed, and we've got a little bit of an annulus or ring down there. The cap is going to look a little bit textured, and you may notice a little bit of, like a toothed edge to the margin of that cap. That, of course, is that veil remnant hanging off of here. Over here we see one, boy, the sheath is almost entirely washed off of this one from the rain, but we get a sense of that umbinate cap. This one especially, let's give this a tug. So you can see that really well-defined umbo in the center of this. Again, the sheath and ring are almost entirely washed off. But this is really quite a beautiful mushroom. I've seen a lot of the different DNA sequences, and there's a lot that is unnamed still in this territory. So Danny Miller has put out some interesting info on the DNA sequences that go along with these. I'm not 100% sure of which species that this is for that reason. There's a lot that look fairly similar, but we'll just call it the common powder cap. We'll label it Cystoderma amianthanum for now, but that probably comes with a PNW 02 or 3 or some number after that. But what a beauty, right? And wow, just like that, we're back into the Chanterelles. And I gotta say, from a distance, this one's looking pretty darn good. This is more what I was hoping to bump into today. This doesn't look too waterlogged or soggy. Looks pretty darn good. Boy, I'll tell you what, for a December chanterelle, this one will definitely make the cut. Looking pretty good. And oh boy, just off the trail, caught a glimpse of another one. It's also looking pretty darn fresh and surprisingly young for this time of year. We've got at least a couple of them. Let's give this bigger guy a tug and see if he's looking as good as the one that we just found a second ago. This is kind of, yeah, this is gonna be primo. Yeah, so for December, doesn't get much better than this. This one is held up really, really good in spite of the rain and the cold and all that good stuff. This one still has a really nice form and stature. And to be honest, I'm kind of surprised to see this younger, smaller chanterelle. This is quite the delicacy here, a week into December. So definitely excited about these. These are the chanterelles that I was hoping to encounter. They'll definitely be coming with us today. And take a look at this. As I move down the trail, we've got another well-decomposed log here off to the side of the trail, and look what we've got growing right out of it. Yet another deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus atropurpureus. So as referenced earlier today, this is one that seems to have saprophytic tendencies. Look at this. So this one, it's got a little bit of a bolete eater mold on it in the Hypomyces genus. We see that showing up as a white mold with a little yellowing down there towards the base. And we can see, I mean, this is definitely by no means a fresh deep purple bolete. It's been nibbled on quite extensively in a way that I rarely see. But let's dig down here in case you have any doubts. Let's inspect more closely the source or root of this. We can see clearly growing from well-decomposed wood. We can see the mycelium kind of wrapped up within that woody structure there. I ordinarily wouldn't disturb this, but just to kind of demonstrate and for educational purposes, we'll peel this back a little bit. It is possible, you know, some of these old logs will serve as nurse logs, so there can be root systems that develop within these well-decomposed logs and stumps, and I suppose that's possible, but I think more likely than not, this is one that's kind of has those saprobic tendencies and may capitalize on the opportunities when they present. But again, you know, anyone's guess. But I find it very interesting. Let me know if you've got any thoughts on that. And just a little further down the trail, boy, this is a classic look for a red alder. I love how they'll do this sometimes, how they'll grow at really odd angles. This one kind of hanging over the trail, and we see growing from that, we've got our late fall, or sometimes referred to as the winter or green oyster. This is Sarcomyxis ceratina. And notice that those are really light colored gills underneath on this one. Oftentimes in age, those will turn an orangish color, but we see that metallic kind of gray looking cap on this guy, and just growing straight out of the snag here amongst the mosses. And as we look up this, we see quite a few flushes of this. So I know we talked about this in the last episode that we put out, so I won't go through this at length, but just to rehash really quickly. So in Japan, this is actually widely sought out as both a medicinal and culinary mushroom. There it's referred to as the mukataki, or the peeling oyster. Out here, it's pretty rare that I see anyone seek this out for the table, but an edible and medicinal nonetheless, that I'm told is not bad if you prepare it correctly. So consider peeling the cap to remove some of the bitterness. Certainly a pretty one. Man, I love when alders do that. Just beautiful. And here we've got another one of our favorite deciduous trees. This one a little bit more shrub-like. This is the beaked hazelnut. We see how it grows in this clustered mass. And look down here. Another occurrence here of the turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. So earlier today we saw this on both bigleaf maple and red alder, now fruiting hazelnut. And again, we've got that distinctive kind of white poured surface underneath, banded coloration, a little bit fuzzy on the cap. This one a lot lighter in its coloration than some of the ones that we observed previously on those other tree hosts. So really interesting to see. You know, I mentioned PSK earlier today, and that being the one that's been used primarily in clinical trials in Japan for those cancer drugs. That one is oftentimes cultivated on liquid culture, but I'm curious what the different tree hosts, how those impact, the chemistry of these turkey tails that we observe out here in the wild. Boy, we can see quite the flesh up there in the heights of this one. This is a relatively big and old beaked hazelnut. There's the exact branch or limb that broke off and came down to earth here. But if you've got a favorite kind of tree host for the turkey tail that you forage, I'd be curious to hear about that from you in the comments. It's fascinating to me just to kind of ponder the way that all the different little nuanced details of these different, mushroom species, how their host actually impacts or influences what shows up in the chemical composition. So similar to, with a lot of fruits and veggies and different things, depending on their growing conditions, they can contain a much different host of bioactive compounds. So let me know if you've got any thoughts on that. I think it's something that I have more questions about than answers, but it's intriguing nonetheless. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Mushroom Trail. If you're liking these videos, remember, hit the like button, subscribe, stay tuned, and until next time, happy trails.